Hello and welcome to the launch of Footprint Intelligence's latest report, Growing Regenerative Agriculture, How Businesses Can Help Deliver Impact at Scale, in association with Nestlé Professional. I'm Nick Hughes, Footprint Associate Editor and author of the report. Later you'll hear from an expert panel exploring how regenerative agriculture can be scaled in a way that maximises social, environmental and economic impact. But first, I'll spend around 20 minutes sharing with you some key insights from the report, the third in a series of Footprint Intelligence reports on regenerative agriculture. I'll start by answering the question, why are we talking about regenerative agriculture now? I'll then go on to explore the question of scalability from three different perspectives, those of the farmer, businesses within the food service supply chain, and finally the consumer. And I'll close with some key takeaways. So let's begin with some context on the challenges facing conventional agriculture, which will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure, but will help explain why interest in regenerative agriculture continues to grow and why scaling nature-friendly farming systems like regenerative, but also like organic and agroecological, is so important. Evidence continues to mount over agriculture's vulnerability to a warming planet. 2024 was the hottest year on record, with global temperatures exceeding 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial climate conditions for the first time. Across the UK, 2025 has already broken seasonal climate records for warmth and sunshine, according to the Met Office. Where I'm speaking to you from here, down in Kent, we still have a hosepipe ban in place, such as the ongoing scarcity of water. Yet at the same time, we continue to see the localised impact of flooding across the UK. Extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change are driving up prices of basic commodities, from olive oil and vegetables to cocoa and coffee and many others besides. Extreme variations in weather patterns are now a part of everyday life, and the impact on farms and farming communities cannot be understated. With every passing season, it seems farmers are grappling with huge variations in germination rates, yields, and quality. More so than ever, it's becoming apparent that the conventional high-input, high-output agricultural systems that have come to dominate the UK and global farming landscape since the Second World War are increasingly ill-equipped to cope with weather extremes. Declining soil health has made farmland more susceptible to flooding and drought, while falling rates of biodiversity have deprived farms of the natural ecosystem services provided by pollinators and predators. Farmers already operating on thin margins face a precarious future in which financial volatility is baked into their business model. So what does all this mean? Well, it means there's growing agreement on the need to rewire the food system in a way that builds resilience to future environmental and financial risks, all of which helps provide the context for growing interest in regenerative agriculture among farmers, food businesses, and I think also policymakers, albeit they may not use the language of regenerative quite so explicitly. Those of you who read our first report on regenerative agriculture may recall how we explored in depth the questions of what exactly is regenerative agriculture, what outcomes should it deliver, and whether a fixed set of standards is required. And we revisit those questions in today's report. However, for the purpose of this overview, I will focus less on those questions and more on questions of scalability. Suffice it to say for now that although it still lacks a universally agreed standard, there is growing alignment around the principles of regenerative agriculture, including maintaining soil cover and living roots, fostering plant diversity, reducing soil disturbance and integrating livestock where appropriate to do so, notwithstanding the need to shift average diets away from animal proteins towards more plant-based foods. And there's growing alignment too over the desired outcomes from regenerative farming, such as healthy soils, biodiversity, water storage capacity, and carbon sequestration, as well as social well-being and financial security. So how can regenerative agriculture be scaled quickly while still delivering measurable environmental and social impact? Well, to answer this question, we need first to understand our starting point. Now, it's not straightforward to measure the scale of adoption of regenerative agriculture, given the lack of an agreed standard. However, analysis published by the Sustainable Markets Initiative estimated that regenerative farming accounted for around 15% of global cropland in 2022. And that figure needs to grow to at least 40% by 2030 to help limit climate change to 1.5 degrees. I would suggest there are, broadly speaking, three buckets of approaches to scaling regenerative agriculture. You have individual farmers adopting regenerative principles of their own accord because they see it as the future of farming for their particular system. You have individual food businesses setting targets for adoption of regenerative agriculture within their value chains and working with their producers to deliver it. And then you have collaborative programs that aim to bring together a wide range of stakeholders to scale regenerative agriculture. And of course, there is a degree of overlap between those three. So you'll see on this slide some examples of the targets that have already been set by large multinational food businesses aimed at scaling regen ag within their value chains. Now, it's worth saying that businesses tend to have their own frameworks for what constitutes regenerative agriculture, albeit based on their involvement in global collaborations like SAI. And it's this lack of an agreed standard that tends to be the focus for criticism levelled against the mainstream regenerative movement. Equally, I think there is a growing counter-narrative too that says we mustn't let perfect be the enemy of good, and that widespread adoption of the principles of regenerative agriculture on conventional farms will be crucial in building an altogether more resilient food system as part of a spectrum of more sustainable farming. In short, we're going to need all the tools in the toolbox, from incremental improvements to practices on conventional farms, through to more systemic adoption of regenerative techniques and principles and the more rigid requirements of organic certification. In terms of collaborative initiatives, as well as global platforms like SAI, we're seeing the development of UK-focused initiatives like the Roots to Regen Lighthouse Project, Landscape Enterprise Networks, and Soil Association Exchange Programme, among others, details of which you'll find in the report. But the reach of such schemes remains relatively limited and is more prevalent in some sectors like dairy, red meat and arable than in others like horticulture. In order to scale successfully, those investing in regenerative agriculture need to be confident that it's delivering results. And there have been some promising signs in terms of indicators such as yield and profitability and environmental impact. A small-scale study by the European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture, published earlier this year, found that regenerative farmers achieved on average just 1% lower yields than conventional farms, while using considerably less synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and less pesticide per hectare. Now, we should of course be cautious of reading too much into individual small-scale studies, and quite understandably there remains some skepticism about whether results of small-scale trials can be replicated at scale. But some of the initial results are certainly encouraging. So let's explore the question of scalability from three perspectives, beginning with the farmer. And I think it's important to remember that for proponents, a key strength of regenerative agriculture is that it gives the farmer agency to drive change. It does not seek to prescribe a set of practices farmers must follow, but encourages flexibility and context specificity. Farmers do, however, need the support of their supply chain partners to invest in a transition which can take several years to produce positive returns. They cannot be left to figure all of this out by themselves. And yes, that support includes access to upfront capital to invest in new equipment, but it also means sharing of risk through longer-term contracting arrangements and non-direct financial support in terms of training and knowledge exchange. We found that farmers are still taking on the majority of the financial risk in transitioning away from conventional farming. And those farmers we spoke to for this and our other reports were united in wanting that risk to be better shared moving forwards. That includes rewarding the delivery of public goods like emissions reduction, biodiversity, benefits and clean water that don't currently have a consistent market value. Government policy is slowly moving in that direction of offering public money for public goods, though with some quite significant budgetary constraints. And so we're starting to see the private sector step in and plug some of that gap. The Soil Association Exchange Programme I mentioned earlier, for example, enables businesses within a farm's value chain to make payments to farmers in return for a verifiable reduction in on-farm carbon emissions. Another emerging market trend is for private sector organisations that rely on healthy ecosystems to make direct payments to farmers for delivering beneficial environmental services. Wild Farm, for example, has spoken of how some of its wheat growers are now receiving direct payments from water companies linked to the improved water storage capacity of their soils, which reduces nutrient runoff into local rivers. So although there's growing alignment on the need to reward farmers for delivering verifiable environmental benefits, work towards harmonising metrics and methodologies for measuring many of the desired outcomes from regenerative agriculture remains a work in progress. And that helps explain why a lot of businesses offering financial support to farmers are currently linking this support to practice changes rather than outcomes, although that might shift over time. Looking forward, the ability to measure a range of outcomes in a consistent way will be key to rewarding those farming regeneratively for the impact that they are having. And it will also be an important guardrail in ensuring that this term regenerative isn't being used to champion farming that is merely tinkering around the edges of conventional agriculture rather than changing farming systems. So if we move on to the role of the supply chain, food businesses all along the food service and hospitality supply chain, and of course retail and manufacturing supply chains, have a key role to play in helping remove structural barriers to growing the supply of regeneratively produced food and drink. Regenerative agriculture will only deliver impact at scale if supply chains can evolve to ensure a commercially viable, sustainable route to market for regeneratively farmed products. What does that mean in practice? Well, among other things, as we've already noted, it means buyers will need to explore longer-term contracting potentially for certain commodities to give farmers confidence to invest in the transition. It will require a shift away from adversarial supplier-buyer relationships, where they still exist, to a more open collaborative culture. Local supply chain infrastructure has been eroded in recent decades as supply chains have consolidated and centralised. Where this is the case, it may be that there's also a need to develop bespoke supply chains that allow regeneratively produced ingredients to be traceable from farm to fork and ensure the farmers receive a fair share of the profits. Excuse me. These kind of shifts won't be easily achieved. The challenge will not be so much in growing the supply of high value items like specialty meats, for which there is an established group of customers willing to pay a premium for more sustainable options. The challenge will be more around lifting the baseline for how we produce low value, uniform commodities. To hit that 40% figure I mentioned earlier for regenerative penetration, large businesses sourcing mainstream commodities at scale will need to come on the regenerative journey too. And we're starting to see some evidence of that happening, albeit again at a small scale. So McDonald's has been supporting a pilot led by FAI Farms to see how the adoption of an adaptive multi-paddock grazing system can help lower carbon emissions for beef and deliver improvements in other key environmental, economic and social indicators. Fresh Direct is working with some of its large-scale vegetable farmers to adopt more regenerative practices like border cropping and tree and shrub planting that will improve the hydrology and biodiversity of the farms and improve their climate resilience. Now, of course, this doesn't represent systemic change by any means, but they are baby steps in the right direction. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have pioneers like Oaxaca sourcing 100% British regenerative beef from grassroots farming across its menu. And you have Wild Farms rewiring a long-established supply chain for wheat, which in many ways is the ultimate commodity crop, with end-to-end traceability for bread made with wheat sourced from regenerative farms. And Wild Farms' growth through both retail and food service channels over the past year has been phenomenal. We talk a lot about finance being a barrier to adoption of regenerative practices. The procurement function has a critical role to play in changing the way businesses contract with their suppliers. These are the people who in many cases hold the direct relationships with suppliers, not sustainability teams. To reiterate, regenerative agriculture requires a different dynamic from traditional procurement contracts, with an emphasis on long-term agreements that provide security of supply and potentially bonus payments for implementing certain practices. And we're seeing evidence of that in some corporate supply chains. But it requires a shift in commercial mindset and the engagement and commitment of people throughout the organisation. And just to close this section, it's important to remember that public procurement is another key potential lever for scaling regenerative agriculture through stronger buying standards and tenders that give weight to social and environmental benefits. So we'll turn finally to the consumer's role in scaling regenerative agriculture. I'm going to leave you for 30 seconds to read these quotes, because as you may have guessed, I need to cough again. I'm nursing a bit of a cold currently, so bear with me. But yes, you'll see some quotes from the report there that I think are really interesting, and I will touch on those in a moment. Right, excuse me. So yes, the consumer's role in scaling regenerative agriculture. My feeling is that this is the least straightforward question to answer regarding what is the role of the farmer, the supply chain, and the consumer. And I'll explain why. What I'm about to say is an oversimplification of a nuanced issue, but essentially there are two schools of thought here. On the one hand are those who believe food grown in regenerative systems should ultimately become the default, with no need to communicate its provenance to consumers. This is a job for farmers and food companies alone. And on the other hand, you have those who argue that consumers actually can fulfill a key role by driving market demand for regenerative food and drink. But of course, in order for that to happen, they will need to know what they are buying was indeed produced regeneratively. And this is where this question of regenerative standards and certification comes into sharp focus, because if we're seeking to create a new market tier for regenerative food, as is happening in some places already, businesses will need to be really transparent in showing how production of that food is benefiting the environment and society, or risk breeding public cynicism and facing charges of greenwashing. What we do know is that there is little evidence of regenerative being a term that resonates strongly with consumers at the moment, albeit most people can have a reasonably good stab at what regenerative farming entails. Now, some experts interviewed for this report felt it's not necessary for the public to know what regenerative means, so long as they have a sense that it's doing some good. Others argued it shouldn't be a consumer-facing term at all. We have seen some brands make the term regenerative part of their marketing. Wild Farmed is one obvious example, but also Ask Italian menus now reference the fact that the pizza is made from 100% regenerative wild farmed flour. McCain has run TV adverts featuring regenerative potato farmers, and it says its own research suggests people are interested in learning about regenerative agriculture. A key point to make, I think, is that those businesses communicating publicly their support for regenerative must think deeply about this question of whether they can substantiate those claims or else risk falling foul of green claims legislation, which, as we know, has recently been strengthened. And here, legal experts believe the lack of an agreed definition for regenerative could cause issues. And I think that helps explain moves to create certification schemes for regeneratively produced food and drink via schemes like Regenified, which is mostly a US scheme, and a Greener World, sitting alongside those bespoke standards developed by the likes of Wild Farms, McCain and others. A couple more quick points to make regarding the consumer. One is around price. Currently, the cost of farming more sustainably largely ends up on the product, which places quite a low ceiling on the market appeal. This comes back to a point made previously about the need to rethink how the added value derived from regenerative farming in areas like biodiversity, soil health, and climate resilience is accounted for within value chains, so that we're not relying entirely on consumers alone to pick up the tab. And secondly, there is emerging evidence that food produced in healthy soils is intrinsically more nutritious than the same food produced in degraded soils. And given that research tends to show that people's purchasing habits and decisions are more motivated by their own health rather than the health of the planet, it could be that the relative nutrient density of crops grown regeneratively is the thing that ultimately motivates a critical mass of people to start buying these products. So that's a top-line summary of the report, which I of course urge you to go away and read. I will leave you for now with some key takeaways, which you can also find in the report, so no need to scribble them down or start taking photographs. I think what's clear to me, having researched this report, is that this isn't a transition that will happen overnight. And we do need guardrails in place to ensure that this term regenerative doesn't just become a rather meaningless catch-all for practices that tinker around the edges of conventional agriculture, in the same way you could argue the term sustainable has somewhat become. But equally, the potential to drive change at scale in a way that hasn't really happened to date through conventional certification schemes is really encouraging and feels like an opportunity to be seized as much as possible. So at this point, we're going to move on to our panel discussion. We have a terrific panel of guests joining us for the discussion. I'd like to introduce James Evans. James is Director of Farming Operations at Grassroots Farming. Dr. Vincent Walsh is founder at Regen Farm Co. And Michael Warmington is Regeneration Lead for Nestlé UK. Welcome to you all. I'm looking forward to you sparing my voice temporarily for a few moments. Michael, perhaps I can come to you first. I referenced Nestlé's commitment to regenerative agriculture in the slides. What has motivated Nestlé to set a target for 50% of key ingredients to be sourced from farmers adopting regenerative agriculture by 2030?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks for the presentation. Happy to spare your throat for a moment here. I think, for Nestlé, if we look at the last few years, gives a good example of why we've made that decision to focus on sourcing from farms practicing regeneratively. We've had one of the wettest years, one of the driest, warmest years on record, just in the last 2 or 3 years, I think. So it's a great example of how real the effects of the climate crisis are in this country already. And if we, for Nestlé, if we think about both the effect of climate on us, on the supply chain and on the business's resilience, as well as the effect of the supply chain on climate change, so we want to reduce the carbon emissions that are contributing to climate change. And of course, regenerative agriculture is one important means of doing that for Nestlé. Scope 3 emissions are more than 90% of our carbon footprint. So if we're going to address the business's carbon footprint, we have to look at the supply chain. We have to look at agriculture because that's the lion's share of the supply chain. So that's one reason that it's the right thing to do in terms of the impact the business is having on climate. But then if we flip that round, as I said, and look at, well, what is the impact of those changes in weather on the business? We take, for example, our cereals business, all the wheat and the oats going into cereals, into shredded wheat and Cheerios. It's all British produce. And we want that to be the case for the foreseeable future. So we want to do everything we can to help those farmers become more resilient to those changes in and swings in weather that we're seeing. And I think Regen Ag is the best tool we've got, in order to build that resilience on farm. So I think those are the two driving factors for us. Not to mention sort of the growing consumer interest in this space, and people be more interested in the kind of provenance and sustainability of what they consume.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And yeah, we'll certainly come on to talk about consumer communications a little bit later on, because I think that's a really interesting part of this conversation. James, we're talking about scalability in this report, and it seems from the outside looking in, the grassroots has started to build some real momentum behind regenerative beef. But of course, it's still relatively small scale. So what do you believe is the key to scaling adoption of regenerative agriculture?
I think probably one of the key factors is getting the farmers on board, to give them the confidence to invest and to transition across. I think we've seen recently that the challenge for farmers is that they quite often are sort of reluctant to change. They've got a system of farming that is, I wouldn't say is yeah, I guess it's broken in some ways, but the challenge of changing that is huge, and they need the confidence. And hopefully what we can support them with it is the confidence that actually by transitioning to a regen model will allow them to find markets that reward them for the good they're doing, whereas under a conventional system they keep working in the same system I've done, struggling to find it. So yeah, it's that confidence in the market really, and sort of the consumer and the customers investing in regen.
And of course, the price of beef has been in the news recently. It's soared in the past year or so. How does that affect the dynamic in terms of your ability to persuade farmers to come on this journey with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a challenge. I mean, the price of beef is a great thing for farmers at the moment, but actually, it only highlights the problems in the food sector. We're ever since I've been involved with farming, we're very much stuck in a cycle of boom or bust. So at the moment, we're seeing extremely high prices for cattle, which is affecting the whole supply chain. And the knock-on effect of that is, that there can be a shortage. We can get imports in produced to lower standards. But what's this going to happen now? It's not giving the confidence to farmers to actually invest back into the supply chain because of the risk. So at the moment, for farmers to buy calves to take them on at current prices, that's great. But we all know in farming that when something is good, there's a good chance that in 2-3 years' time, and that's how long the cycle is, it might not be there in the first place. So if we can get the industry to invest in these supply chains, give the farmers the confidence that it's really worth pursuing, then that I think is critical to making regen sort of more enforceable.
And Vincent, how about you? What do you think needs to happen to scale the kind of approaches that you've been piloting at Regen Farm Co? And actually, do you want to talk us through what it is you're doing up there in Yorkshire? Because I know it's some really interesting stuff going on.
Yeah, well, I think, as Michael said, I think it's important to innovate right at the beginning of the supply chain to scale up, because it has a massive knock-on effect to scope 3 emissions. And particularly when farmers are looking for more capital to basically support that transition, if they can prove that they are doing that, there is an opportunity then to develop new collaborations with the food companies, particularly in hospitality. I think there's a huge opportunity for farmers to develop new collaborations and the corporates to support some of that transition. I think if you innovate right at the beginning of the supply chain, that rolls all the way through the supply chain. So there's an opportunity for everybody there to get involved if you're innovating right at the beginning of the supply chain. Let's talk about system design. I think hydrology is so important. I think if you look at the global south, I think they're very much in front of us in terms of integrating really intelligent hydrology into landscapes and farms. And particularly over the last 3 years, I think particularly this year, as Michael was saying, it's been extremely dry. And then because of that knock-on effect, that when the water does come, the water just completely drain off farm straight away, or flooding. So I think in terms of hydrology, I think there's a huge opportunity to integrate better hydrology into farms. What does that look like? For example, I've got a 92-acre farm, so it's tiny in the uplands of Yorkshire. But in that 92 acres, I've integrated 45 water features, swales, berms, ponds, dams, etc. Not 45 separate systems, 45 integrated systems across a 92-acre landscape in the uplands of Yorkshire on a sheep farm. We've got about 200 sheep. To do that, you need collaborations on the farm. Farmers are not complex ecosystem designers, and complex ecosystem designers are also not farmers. What you need is to integrate them to key knowledges. And I've been doing that with an 82-year-old farmer in the uplands of Yorkshire called Derek Greenwood. Been farming that land since 7 years old, 4th generation. If an 82-year-old can collaborate with me to transition a landscape, any farmer can do it. But I think we need to bring two different key knowledges to enable that transition.
Super, thanks, Vincent.
On that. Sorry, Nick. I just want to pick up because I think Vincent has made the point about the partnerships, and James making the point about which I really liked about having confidence. Farmers actually having confidence and some certainty. Because if there's one thing they deal in, it's uncertainty. And so if you can have a partnership that introduces that degree of confidence, particularly over a longer period of time, I think that's where you start to get successful scale, successful adoption. I think Nestlé's milk plan, so that's the sort of program we have to source regeneratively produced milk up in Cumbria and Ayrshire, has been just that. It's works in 5-year cycles with one close partnership with First Milk, who provide all of our fresh milk needs here. So you have both the partnership element that Vincent's referring to, and that long-term confidence in what the future might look like, because you've got a 5-year cycle. I think they're really important ingredients for scale.
Can I just come in there as well, Nick? Sorry.
Yeah, of course, Vincent.
Yeah, I think you've already kind of mentioned, but I think it's really important to be authentic around the systems that we are designing, particularly large corporates. I've seen a number of reports this year where, particularly around potatoes, it wasn't McCain's, it was another company, saying that the farm is fully regenerative, and it's just not true. And I would rather corporates be really honest about where they are in that journey, to say, look, we might be developing regenerative principles into our farming systems, but we are not there yet. This is not a fully regenerative farm. We are based on an industrial system where we're trying to integrate some key principles to make the transition. I think that is honest, and I think and that's okay. What isn't okay is to say that what we're doing is fully regenerative, because what it actually it devalues all the great other work happening across the sector. And I think corporates have a huge responsibility to just be really authentic. And as you said, Nick, we can't make that transition in a year or a couple of years. It's a huge challenge to go from an industrial system to a fully regenerative system, and we really need to be honest about that, because it'll make the future and the future arguments and debates and narratives around regenerative agriculture so much easier if we're just very authentic about where we are now and where we're going.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. And that, that comes back to this point around whether the term regenerative is a consumer-facing tool. And if it is, the need to have some guardrails around that in order to protect those producers that really are engaging in systemic change rather than sort of tinkering around the edges. But and as I said, we'll come on to the consumer a little bit later. Michael, I just want to pick up on your point around partnerships, and you mentioned the milk plan, your relationship with First Milk, and their dairy farmers. Are those kind of partnerships replicable across different commodities, different ingredients? Because obviously, as a business, you'll be sourcing lots of different ingredients. Is that kind of partnership replicable, and what are the challenges in translating it to other segments?
Yeah, I think it's quite context dependent and on the supply chain. So, it's worked quite well in milk because it's quite a short, direct supply chain. There's milk being produced in Cumbria, it's going onto the truck, and it's going to a Nestlé factory. And we've got a group of farmers. The last 5 years has been 80-ish farmers in that milk plan that have been worked with very closely on adopting certain practices, regenerative practices, and kind of increasing that over time and getting a premium payment on every litre of milk for practices adopted. So it's been really transparent about what's actually happening on farm, and it's been very clear who's involved and where the product's going. That is obviously hard to translate. You talked about wheat being sort of, like the ultimate commodity crop. It's hard to translate that model straight into the wheat supply chain because of the complexities of that supply chain and the number of actors and harder to track the grain flows. And in those supply chains, we've, maybe using slightly different approaches, joining kind of landscape programs and that type of thing. So I do think it's not a case of, being able to cut and paste one approach from one particular area and one particular commodity or ingredient into another area and another crop. But I think you can take elements of it, and understand what's worked and what hasn't, and then try and copy the elements or the principles, and that, the milk plans worked well because you've got that long-term partnership, you're incentivizing practices. So, can you take those elements and use them elsewhere, even if you can't copy the whole model? I think that's maybe something to consider.
Yes. Okay. Terrific. Thanks, Michael. James, I don't want to get too hung up on policy and government here. Of course, we touch on it in the report, but in terms of support for farmers, public support to scale regenerative approaches, do you feel farmers are currently getting the support they need to commit to a long-term transition to regen ag? And if not, where is the support currently lacking, do you think?
I think it was starting to come through the SFI scheme, but with that, the uncertainty around that. But I think as an industry, and the work that Nestle are doing is great. I think as a collective, we need to embrace this and not rely on government to support this. We need to actually, have investment from within the supply chain itself. And I feel like the work that we do at grassroots farming now, we're able to speak directly to the customer, whereas for far too long we've been kept apart. The farming industry has been so far removed from the actual food industry. So we've been, as farmers, we've been commodity producers. And I think when we speak to our farmers now, they feel like they're food producers because they've got a direct link with the end customer. But that support needs to come from within the supply chain itself. We can't rely on government support. We know that subsidies reducing, the SFI, it was nice while it lasted, but we can't rely on that. So we as an industry now, and just getting ourselves around the table could work that how we can support it and take the volatility out of the marketplace.
Yes, and you're obviously getting traction with a number of businesses within the food service and hospitality sector, like Oaxaca and Fuller's and WSH, I know. And Vincent highlighted food service, hospitality, as actually having quite a key role to play. Do you concur with that? And what is the role of restaurants and caterers in supporting the growth of regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, I mean it's great actually that the food service is very much behind regen for all sorts of reasons, and we get a lot of our contacts come from a sustainability point of view, and obviously as we know, regen ticks all those boxes, but the challenge is that any money for in the supply chain to help farmers is just put on the cost of the product, so the cost of the beef, and then that can have a negative effect on procurement because procurement's aims aren't necessarily aligned with sustainability aims of a company. So we need to find a way of bridging that gap. And I think, in the past, procurement, but particularly wasn't necessarily aligned with sustainability goals. But now we're seeing a shortage of products and the risk of not being able to get hold of that. We've seen, coffee and chocolate, around the world, the prices have gosh, increased by almost 100% in a lot of cases, more, and that's due to a lack of supply. And I think people are realizing now that procurement teams are going that we need to be able to secure this product, and that can be done through long-term contracts and having a regen mindset around procurement, which perhaps in the past was the sustainability was seen as a nice to have type thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and this sort of misalignment between procurement and sustainability, or historic misalignment, is something we see across quite a lot of sustainability areas, whether that's scope 3 reduction or packaging or waste or whatever it may be. Um, Michael, let's touch on sort of that better alignment between sustainability and procurement from Nestlé's perspective. How are those people working in key operational roles like procurement and commercial being engaged with Nestlé's commitment to regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, I mean that's massive for the long-term success. I mean, even at a big company, obviously working in partnership across different teams is always important. But when you're particularly looking at more sustainable supply chain and regen in particular, it just comes right to the top of your priority list. Regen ag is not a switch that you can just turn on and off with a contract. It's obviously it's a mindset shift. It's a commitment over time. It takes years. So you've got to have that partnership, and you've got to be working with your procurement team to build that understanding that this isn't something we can just contract in and out of in any given year. Just I think 2 weeks ago I was stood on a farm with one of our suppliers in the east of England. We had myself there, some colleagues from the sustainability team. We had global buyer for the particular crop we were looking at, who'd come in from Europe. We had someone for a sort of commercial category role from Nestlé on farm. So I think maybe that paints the picture a bit of, plus obviously the farmer, the supplier, all those people, the kind of cast list of who you actually want involved if you're going to make it work from top to bottom, from farmer through supplier, through procurement, your corporate sustainability work, and then taking it to a customer and a commercial part of the business. So I think that's the sort of breadth and depth of collaboration you need up and down the value chain and within the business to actually make it work.
So let's touch then on this question of cost and where it should be absorbed within the value chain. I think we can sort of generally, a bit of a generalization, but there probably will be some additional cost during the early years of the transition. Should the end consumer be expected to pick up those costs and pay a premium for food produced regeneratively? Or should those additional costs be absorbed within the value chain and or via public or private finance or a mixture of both? Vincent, where do you stand on that?
I would say probably a mixture of both. I think consumers do want to know where the food coming from, that how it's grown, that it's the best, and therefore I think there is a willing to do that. We've seen it in the organic sector. I think people are willing to pay more. But I also do think, that there is the larger food companies have a responsibility to support that, particularly at the beginning of the supply chain, and support farmers to transition around that scope 3 emissions. So I think there's opportunity, and I think it might be different for, retail is very different to hospitality, how they speak to their end consumer. I know people like Levy are doing a lot around their stadiums to make sure, across kind of horse racing right through to football, that they're speaking to the end consumer, so the end consumer understand at stadium level why they're making that transition. And that's completely different to the approach, for example, Wild Farm at the retail end, even though they are doing some hospitality work. So I think there's huge amounts of opportunity to develop new narratives and new conversations with the end consumer. And I think they are very switched onto it, and want to know more about where their food's coming from.
James, where do you sit on this question of who pays for it?
Yeah, I mean, in the short term, the price premium has to go on the product because we're not getting the investment coming through from the supply chain. And I think, that's, I don't want to say short-sighted, because that's not fair, because I think everyone has genuinely got a vested interest in wanting to do good. But I think until we start seeing major investment come back up the supply chain or down the supply chain to farmers, then it's always going to land on the product itself, which is going to hamper scale. So, in time, yes, we know that there's cost savings for the farmers to be regenerative, but that transition needs investment somehow. So if we can get investment from the supply chain through hospitality or food service, that's the key, because that's long termism. That will guarantee supply. That will mean that regen can be produced at scale, and then in 10 years time, hopefully, that especially with beef, regen will be the norm. It'll be the only way that beef should be produced. But until we get investment and people sort of wanting to have that foresight that spend it now rather than it cost you later attitude, then we'll have to put the price on the product in the short term, which isn't helping anybody.
And because you have to put the price on the product in the short term, does that mean you therefore need to be able to communicate to consumers the value in the farming system that has produced that beef? Because I know we've spoken before, haven't we, James? You're a bit on the fence about whether regenerative is a consumer-facing term. But if people are paying a premium for something, they kind of need to know why they're paying a premium for it.
Yes, I mean, I am on the fence. I mean, regenerative. We've done some panels with the companies that we supply, and regenerative. Some people understand it. Some people think it's quite a derogatory term, especially when it comes to meat. So it's difficult, and I think slowly but surely the term regenerative is getting out there. But what I've noticed is that customers trust their brands, and I think if brands understand it, that's almost where it needs to stay for now. We do a lot of testing on farm that has third party verification, and that's what's so important to the companies that we supply. The customer isn't necessarily asking for that, but it gives the assurance, and it avoids the risk of any greenwashing. And I think that's what we are at risk at, is the term regenerative can just get banded out there in a farming term because someone has ditched their plough for 1 year or not sprayed a field, and that isn't regenerative. Regenerative to us is measuring continual improvements.
Yeah, just maybe to come in on that, Nick. I think I sort of agree with what James is saying in terms of the language, but I think maybe it's about customers or consumers understanding what it is and why it matters, like not us getting so much caught up on what the right word is for that. I think there are other people maybe better qualified on these kind of things to figure out what works. I think it makes sense to follow what's effective and what people respond to, think the important thing is that people do start to understand, what it is, what we're talking about, and what matters, why it's impactful, and we figure out what the right language for that to communicate that is. But I think from our perspective, that's the important thing, and whether it's food services or retail, there's an opportunity to tell that story. Whether regenerative is the best word to tell a story, I don't know, but I think it's an important story to tell.
So perhaps if we're not explicitly talking about regenerative, but we want to tell that story around, environmental improvement, social improvement, even from adopting these farming systems, we need to be able to measure outcomes, and we need to be able to do so in a reasonably harmonized way so that we're not comparing apples with pears. Do you, perhaps Vincent, I'll throw this one to you. Do you believe that that's the way we should be going with this, aligning around outcomes and how to measure them, rather than necessarily prescribing a standard or a certification scheme for regenerative?
Well, I think it's important to understand, to recognise that everybody's at different stages on different journeys on getting to be a regenerative farm or system. But when it comes to the biosphere, the region of the Earth system where all life resides, and how the Earth system has evolved, it's singular. There is only one energetically open, materially closed, ecological life support system, and that system is highly regenerative. Yeah, it's why we are here today, and that system has evolved in a certain way. Hydrology 4.1 billion years ago, photosynthesis 3.5 billion years ago, fungus 1.5 billion years ago, soil is the younger sister for only 450 million years, complex life only came 700 million years ago. In terms of our understanding of complex ecological life support systems, we fully know what a regenerative system is. Coral reefs, mangroves, woodlands, forests, etc. So the idea that we don't know what a regenerative system is absolutely nonsense. What I think it's important, again, it goes back to being kind of authentic and how we speak about it. I think we do need to, be very careful about how we position it and where we are now, and how we're going to move forward with the term, because like you said, it's happened with the word sustainability. It means nothing. And actually, when you look at the Brundtland report, I think it was 1987 when the first report came out, or it might have been 78, can't remember now. What have we sustained in that time? Actually, very little. And I very much think the way that the term is being banged around is really not helpful. But I'll go back to the original point. Do we know what a true regenerative system is? Yes, we do. And all we need to do is mimic them principles into our farming systems.
Okay, yeah. That's interesting. I guess, there's translating that knowledge, isn't there, into frameworks for measuring impact, both in terms of businesses' own reporting and also in terms of consumer communication. And James, I guess you've sort of done that, haven't you, with your grassroots farming standard? Do you feel that individual standards, private standards from individual organisations, will be the way we take this forward, rather than a unified, universal certification scheme like organic, for example? Do you think that is something like that is less applicable to regenerative farming?
Yeah, I do, and I think that's perhaps why the industry struggles with regenerative, because everyone likes to put everything in a box that's been used before. Whether it be organic or red tractor, it's a tick box exercise. And as Vincent said, that it's not a standard. Every farm is different, and every farmer is different. And they're starting from a different place, albeit to get to the same place. And that's why it's so difficult just to have one standard across all different food sectors. So we're very proud of our grassroots standards for beef. and they can be rolled out perhaps into different sectors. But every food sector has got its own nuances, and that's the challenge that I don't think the consumers and industry isn't used to, and that's why people struggle. I think with regen is the fact that it's not a standard thing that everyone is used to, and it's just when we started along this business, it was just a case of having standards, having a third party verified tick box, away you go, and we soon realised that every farm is different, so we need to make those allowances really. And like you said before, we can't let perfect get in the way of good really. So being honest is great for the industry, and I think people are realizing that we're not trying to be perfect. We're saying our farmers are at one point, we're trying to get to here, and I know it's a cliche, but they're on a journey of trying to get better, and that's all we can ask for.
Mm. Yes, and that's I mean, I think that's a nice point to close on. This idea that we're talking about scale within this report, and but scale without impact won't solve the challenges facing the food system, and we need to keep sight of the need to demonstrate tangible social, environmental, and economic impact from adoption of regenerative farming. Look, we're out of time, so can I say a huge thank you to our panel for contributing to a fascinating discussion, to James, Vincent, and to Michael. Whatever your own view on regenerative agriculture and however your business or organization is supporting it, I hope you found lots of useful insight to take away with you. There is lots more, I promise, in the report itself, and it will be dropping into inboxes very shortly, so I do hope you enjoy reading it. Thank you to our report partner, Nestlé Professional, and thank you for joining us for this launch. Goodbye.